everybody to Milltown State Park. My name is Jess Martin, and I am the AmeriCorps member for the Hellgate District. So the Hellgate District encompasses here at Milltown, but also Frenchtown Pond, Council Grove, and Fish Creek. Also here from the state parks, we have our park ranger and then our park manager. Our park manager is Mike Kustudia, and our park ranger is Ben Dickinson. So I'm just going to do a quick overview of the day for everyone to expect what's going on. So right now we will get started with just a few introductions, and then we'll be moving on to some labor songs. And then after that, at 1 o'clock, we do have the Mystery of the Wobbly Massacre. And then at 2:30, we have another round of labor songs. And then at 3 o'clock, we have Untold Stories of Montana Minorities with Ellen. And so at any point, it's kind of a free-flowing event, but that's just a little bit of the schedule. If anyone needs an update on those times, once again, feel free to come talk to us. And then to get started with some more introductions, I'm going to have Judy Maxson come up and talk a little bit about the Bonner Milltown History Center.
Thanks, Jess. It is so fun to see familiar faces and new faces for one of our events because as those of you are familiar with the Bonner Milltown History Center, we have a roundtable history event 3 times a year, January, February, and March, but that ended in March of 2020. We didn't even get to have our March program. So we're back finally with a little preview event this summer. I'd like to thank Milltown State Park for inviting us to participate with this. We have a tool display along with a State Park photo display of historic artifacts over there. Please take a look. And we would invite you to visit the History Center. We're in the Bonner Post Office building, right next door to the post office in Bonner, Montana, up the street. Our hours are Tuesday and Wednesday mornings from 9 to 11:30, so please stop by and visit us at any time. And we're always also looking for volunteers, so if you kind of like what you see here today and would like to be a part of something that's preserving the history of this great spot, give us a call. We would love to talk to you about that too. So enjoy the program.
Awesome, thank you so much, Judy. So now we are going to get started with the labor songs, but real quick, I'm going to introduce our leader. And so we have Scott Crichton here with us today. Scott was raised as a son of a boss in the industrial city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He first came to Montana on the Hiawatha at the age of 5 in 1953 to Deer Lodge to visit his grandparents who owned and operated Crichton Hardware. At age 14, he reported to work at his father's corporation to learn the business from the ground up. Over the next 7 years, he was mentored by various union members, warehousemen, teamsters, laborers, and bricklayers. At the age of 21, he sang on a picket line for the first time. He has continued to support workers and workers' rights throughout his adult life as a member of several unions, from the United Food and Commercial Workers to the American Civil Liberties Union. Please welcome Scott.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Before I start singing, I have a couple of things I have to say. And one is that I learned this week that I am encouraged to tell you not to sing along. How is that for folk music? You're going to save me a lot of time on choruses, but there are some wonderful songbooks. And if you didn't get one, they've got some around here. Jess, who just introduced me, produced these. She's got them in back. So help yourselves to one, take them home. Maybe a tune will stick with you and you'll want to sing it at some point around a campfire, perhaps. But because of COVID, we're going to keep our respiration down, but I want to get the inspiration up. Start with a ode to the river behind us. There's green Douglas fir where the water cuts through. Down the wild mountains and valleys she flew, the Canadian Northwest in the ocean so blue. You roll on, Columbia, roll on. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Your power is turning our darkness to dawn. You roll on, Columbia, roll on. There's many great rivers add power to you. There's the Yakima Snake and the Hood River too. The Sandy Willamette, the Clicky Clack too. So you roll on, Columbia, roll on. Tom Jefferson's vision would not let him rest. A vision he saw for the Pacific Northwest. He got Lewis and Clark to do the rest. So you roll on, Columbia, roll on. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Your power is turning our darkness to dawn. You roll on, Columbia, roll on. This will come louder now. And up the river there's the Grand Coulee Dam. It's the mightiest thing ever built by the people. The power, the factories, and water the land. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Your power is turning the darkness to dawn. You roll on, Columbia, roll on. At Bonneville now, there are ships in the locks, and the waters have risen, they cover the rocks. Shiploads aplenty, they steam past the docks, and you roll on, Columbia, roll on. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Your power is turning our darkness to dawn. You roll on, Columbia, roll on. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Thank you. I just wanted to remind you that that dam, talk about infrastructure, that dam was built between 1933 and 1942, and more than 11,000 workers put in more than 27 million hours excavating, diverting, and then pouring the concrete. So hats off to labor from the 30s and the Work Progress Administration. I'm going to try something that I've not done in public before, and that's play a banjo. So I treated myself to this instrument during COVID, and I think you will wish I had more time to practice. But this is a song that comes from the oral history that was collected by the State Historical Society, and it's about somebody called a belly robber. Belly robbers were camp cooks for the logging camps. And this particular fellow, Morty Johnson, worked up outside of Olney for a Summers lumber company. And his story you'll hear shortly, but he had a thing called a wanigan, which was essentially, as the camp moved, they would set up the lumber camp, but as they'd move down the river, or up the river to cut more timber, instead of coming back all the time, they took the kitchen to the workers. And so the kitchen was on this raft, the Wanigan. And the way they had it set up was they would plop a plank off the side, and the workers would line up, come across, feed themselves cafeteria style, and then walk back off and find a stump or a log to sit on and eat their meal. My feet hit the floor every morning at 4, 'cause that's when a cook's day began. Make up hot cakes and oatmeal, bacon and eggs, get breakfast out to the men. The flunky would ring and make their dinner bell sing, for the men started work at 7. It weren't fancy food, but it filled them up good, there was always enough by heaven. Oh, weren't fancy food, but it filled them up good, there was always enough back then. Get the pastry out soon, dinner's at noon, pies pert near every day. Short ribs and roast on Sundays, French toast, that's how they ate it old May. On my wood-burning stove I baked 35 loaves for a camp with a crew about 40. My boss would say they're in water all day, so you feed those boys good Morty. Well, my boss would say they're in water all day, so you feed those boys real good. Now there's only one rule, no lumberjack fool would ever break if he's able. You can say pass the beans or potatoes or cream, but you never talk at the table. In those winter camp days, using horse and sleighs, a pretty tough life for the men. If they enjoyed their food, I was doing something good, I like cooking for the logging camp then. If they enjoyed their food, I was doing something good, I like cooking for the logging camp then. My feet hit the floor every morning at 4, 'cause that's when a cook's day began. Make up hotcakes and oatmeal, bacon and eggs, gotta get breakfast out to the men. The flunky would ring and make the dinner bell sing, for the men started work at 7. It weren't fancy food, but it filled them up good, there was always enough by heaven. Oh, it weren't fancy food, but it filled them up good, there was always enough back then. The Belly Robber. Well, that was a song written by Kate Gilsdorf back in 1989 as part of the oral history collection of songs from oral histories. Before we go any further, I'd like to just make an acknowledgement that to the Salish and Kalispel people on whose land we are celebrating this Labor Day today, and our hats are off to them for all the lessons that they've taught us about conserving and caring for the land, and we're appreciative. I don't know who brought my name up to this committee, but I'm grateful to them as well. I haven't played in front of people for 20 years, so I'm grateful for the opportunity. Kim Brigham, who's going to be speaking when I'm done, asked me when we were talking about songs to sing, well, could you learn this one for me? And it was a wobbly song I didn't know. Not like I know every wobbly song, but this is the Little Red Songbook. And This is the IWW songbook to fan the flames of discontent. The 1923, a facsimile of the 1923 edition. And the Wobblies are pretty well known when it comes to labor, and one of the reasons is because they were so good at using songs to get to people and free speech to get to people on the street corners. A little more about that in a minute. But this is a song that is called 50,000 Lumberjacks. And if you think about being a lumberjack back in the day, before the working conditions had been improved, it was cold. Even after, it was cold, wet, and unrewarding work. But this comes with a chorus that talks about such a lot of devils, that's what the papers say. And you need to remember that the papers were owned by the company. So they were not about to say anything favorable about the Wobs. But anyway, here's a little ditty. 50,000 lumberjacks, 50,000 packs, 50,000 dirty rolls of blankets on their backs, 50,000 minds made up to strike and strike like men. For 50 years they'd packed a bed but never would again. Well, such a lot of workers, such a lot of devils, that's what the papers say. They've gone on strike for shorter hours and a raise in pay. They left the camps, those dirty tramps, they all walked out as one. They say we'll win the strike and put the bosses on the bum. With 50,000 wooden bunks full of things that crawl, 50,000 restless men have left them once for all. One by one they dared not say the hours are much too long, but they could shout it out now that they're 50,000 strong. Oh, such a lot of devils, that's what the papers say. They've gone on strike for shorter hours and for better pay. They've left the camps, those lazy tramps, they've all walked out as one. They say we'll win the strike and put the bosses on the bum. Now take a trip, take a tip, miss the boss, plan some cozy rooms, 6 or 8 spring beds in each with towels, sheets and brooms. Shower baths for men who work will keep them well and fit. A laundry true and drying room would help a little bit. And get some dishes white and clean, good pure food to eat. See the cook has help enough to keep the table neat. Tap the bell for 8 hours work, treat the boys like men, and 50,000 lumberjacks will come to work again. Such a lot of devils, that's what the papers say. They've gone on work for shorter hours and for better pay. They've left the camps, the lazy tramps, they've all walked out as one. They say we'll win the strike or put the bosses on the bum. I'm going to move ahead here. Make sure I get this song in for my friend Mike from Anaconda. Because how many songs do you know that come from Anaconda? This is one that's another part of those oral history collections that I told you about. And it comes from the oral history of a guy named Tom Dixon who worked at the smelter on and off for 4 decades. He started to work there in 1925, and they put him to work on a thing called the rustler's shift. It's got nothing to do with cattle. It just was a way to let people know that if they were showing up for the rustler's shift, they never knew what they would be doing that day. They'd be showing up to fill in for somebody who hadn't showed, and so it was being a replacement worker on the call. And he worked in something called Draco, which was the dust recovery and conveying operation, where they would precipitate the arsenic in the stack and reprocess it to get traces of copper, gold, silver, and other minerals. So he talked about it, and that the arsenic was poisonous, and it felt like fire if you touched it, but it was also sweeter than sugar if you tasted it, about 500 times sweeter than sugar. And you'll see that he tasted his share of arsenic. Oh, right where the leader is now was the place where we'd pick up the pay, to the company rustling office where you'd go to get work for a day. Departments running short-handed would call for a worker or two. The rustling office would hire and send us. You never knew what work you'd do. Oh, you never knew where they would send you. You rarely would bring home full pay. But the rustler shift, it was good work and quick and was different every day. At that time the regular wages were $4 a quarter a day. But if you worked on the rustler shift, they'd charge you a half-hour pay. But they'd pay for the time on the streetcar, so you made $3.98. But they charged you $1 if you worked once a month, so you only got $2.98. Well, you never knew where they would send you, and you rarely would bring home full pay. And the rustler shift, it was good work and quick and was different every day. Now the company collected taxes if you happened to work a full week. The poll, the road, and the poor tax they'd take at the end of the week. So if you worked on the rustler shift, you got $2.98. For one of those taxes, they'd take $2 more and leave you with 98 cents. Oh, you never knew where they would send you. You rarely would bring home full pay. But the rustler shift, it was good work and quick and was different every day. It's funny, in that inter-oral history, he talks about how he finally got hefty enough to play football after working in the rustler shift. He gained 25 pounds that summer. So I'm going to spend another couple of minutes talking about the Wobblies. They're just a portion of labor, but that is what Kim's speaking about. One of the really remarkable leaders of the IWW was a woman named Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who I wished I had a chance to meet. She was the daughter of immigrants born in Concord, New Hampshire, who went to public school, and she recalls that as she was being educated, she hated poverty. I was determined to do something about the bad conditions under which our family and all around us suffered. Her parents raised her to be a socialist, and at 15, she was arrested for the first time with her father for a street corner demonstration that they were preaching on the street corner and got arrested. That was her father's last arrest. It was far from her last arrest. And as she was in front of the judge, he said, "Now, young lady, you can't tell me that you really believe that you're speaking about socialism on the street corner is going to change anybody's mind." And she said, "Oh, indeed it will." And she spent, well, by the time she was 17 years old, she was a full-time worker, full-time organizer for the IWW in the West and in the mills back east. I got to think that when Woody Guthrie wrote this song, he was thinking of her. There once was a union maid who never was afraid of the goons or the ginks or the company finks or the deputy sheriffs that made the raid. She'd go to the union hall when a meeting it was called. She'd show her guard to the National Guard. She always stood her ground. "Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking to the union." I can hear you singing, "Sticking to the union, I'm sticking to the union." "Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking to the union, I'm sticking to the union till the day I die." This union maid was wise to the tricks of the company spy. She couldn't be schooled by company stools. She always organized the guys. She'd always get her way. when struck for higher pay. When the Legion boys come round, she always stood her ground. And no, you can't scare me, I'm sticking to the Union. I'm sticking to the Union. I'm sticking to the Union. Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking to the Union. I'm sticking to the Union till the day I die. A woman's struggle is hard, even with a union card. She's gotta stand on her own 2 feet and not be a servant to a male elite. It's time she takes a stand, keep working hand in hand. There is a job that's gotta be done and a fight that's gotta be won. Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking to the Union. I'm sticking to the Union. I'm sticking to the Union. No, you can't scare me, I'm sticking to the Union. I'm sticking to the Union till the day I die. Just to be clear, that women today make up a large and growing proportion of organized labor. In 2014, they were over 42.5% of the rank and file, and in 2014, that had gone up to 45.5%. And I dare say by the time the figures come out for 2024, it'll be half of the people who are in organized labor today are women. The Wobblies had a way of getting under the skin of the establishment. One was free speech. They were more radical than just about any other union because they believed that there was no commonality between the bosses and the workers, and that it was really the only thing that would satisfy is for the workers to take over the means of production and run our society as one big union. That was not well received by the Chamber of Commerce or other members of the establishment. And so when the Wobblies would come to town, they would get on street corners and they just start to speak about socialism. And it got to a point where the police would then arrest them, and the cities would eventually pass ordinances prohibiting public speaking on the streets. It was a great organizing tool. There's a lot of people that could be offended by that kind of prohibition when you've grown up to learn that the First Amendment protects you from any sorts of incursion on free speech. So in a number of towns, including Spokane and Missoula, there were free speech strikes. The jails were filled with Wobblies. They would put the word out along the rails, and a lot of the itinerant workers made their way around the West on on freight trains. Suddenly the town would fill up with Wobs standing on the street corner and starting to speak and getting arrested and filling the jails. It did not take long for the city to say, we're not about to feed these guys and keep them overnight any longer than we have to. And in both Spokane and Missoula, the ordinances were rescinded because of that kind of behavior. So besides speaking, they sang. And they sang songs like this. And it makes mention here, it makes mention of the Salvation Army and in passing, and one of the things that really got under people's skin was that even though the Wobblies were prohibited from speaking, the Salvation Army could speak on the streets with impunity. So. Long-haired preachers come out every night. They try to tell you what is wrong and what's right. But when asked about something to eat, they will answer you in voices so sweet. You will eat by and by in that glorious land above the sky. Work and pray and live on hay. You'll get pie in the sky when you die. The Starvation Army, they sing and they play, and they clap and they'll dance and they'll pray until they get all your coin on the drum. Then they'll answer you in, you're on the bum. You will eat by and by in that glorious land above the sky. Work and pray and live on hay. You'll get pie in the sky when you die. Working people of all nations unite. Hand in hand for freedom we will fight, and the world and its wealth we have gained. To the grafters we will sing this refrain. You will eat by and by when you learn how to cook and how to fry. Go chop some wood, it'll do you good, and you'll eat in the sweet by and by. That's a lie. We're getting to, from the great Atlantic Ocean to the, we'll wait for the Wabash Cannonball to pass here. We've got about 10 minutes before Kim's coming on, and I wanted to make sure that I got to sing this song in the first set. We'll wait for the train. So that was a Joe Hill song. Joe Hill was a poet and a songwriter for the IWW, and he actually was executed by the authorities in Utah for his labor activities and being accused of a murder that was not definitively proved. I can talk over the train, I guess. Last weekend, people gathered outside of Helena to celebrate the life of a huge figure in Montana's labor movement, the boss, Jim Murray. He had passed in October of last year at the age of 85, and this was the first time people got out together to be able to celebrate his life and his accomplishments. Jim was the second executive director of the AFL-CIO, and he just fought tirelessly for the rights of workers and human rights in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s in Montana. When he retired after 25 years of heading the state Fed, he moved on to work for the United Steelworkers to retrain displaced workers in the Rust Belt. Jim was mostly Irish. He was also a descendant of Cherokee and Sioux and Blackfeet nations. He grew up in Laurel, a refinery and rail town, and was a boomer and a roughneck who had worked in the refinery and later became the head of the OCAW, the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union. We owe him a shout out today for his tireless organizing. He was essential in the 1971 crushing defeat of the sales tax referendum. He was instrumental in delivering organized labor supporting the ratification of the 1972 state constitution. His genius put labor into leadership of an unlikely coalition that brought together constituencies from the anti-war movement, senior citizens, women's groups, environmentalists, educators, low-income advocates, Native Americans, and other minorities. And like so many organizers who dedicate themselves to the cause, he was a road warrior crisscrossing the state by car to meet with his fellow workers. He spent most of his life away from the home on the road with workers. and he depended on his partner and spouse Arlene to raise the 5 children. He was charismatic, affable, full of wit and humor, with folksy storytelling and a gift of persuasion, passionate and persuasive about the dignity of work and the power of collective bargaining. Women say he always treated them as equals and respected them in politics, and he looked on his adversaries as opponents, not enemies. Jim's leadership during the progressive eras from 1965 to 1980 resulted in major changes to Montana to benefit workers and their families, whether they're union members or not. From better laws regarding workers' compensation, unemployment compensation, workers' safety, collective bargaining, education funding, the social safety net, environmental advances, and more. All were part of his historical footprint and legacy. So here's to the boss, Jim Murray, an old fighter. Old fighter, you sure took it on the chin. Where'd you ever get the strength to stand? Never giving up nor giving in. You know that I just wanna shake your hand, because people like you help people like me go on, go on. People like you help people like me go on, go on. Old battler with a scar for every town, you thought you were no better than the rest. You wore your colors every way but down, and all you ever gave us was your best. And you know that people like you help people like me go on, go on. People like you help people like me go on, go on. Old dreamer with a world in every thought, where'd you get the vision to keep on? You sure gave back as good as what you got. I hope that when my time is almost gone, they'll say that people like me help people like you go on, go on. Because people like you help people like me go on, go on. People like you help people like me go on, go on, go on. Jim Murray. Thank you.
Alrighty, well, we'll just carry on here. So I'm Mike Kustudia. I'm the park manager here at Milltown State Park. Thank you all for coming out today. We've got our staff on hand. We've got Ben Dickinson back here. He's our park ranger. We got Jess Martin, and we have some of our park techs with us, Goldie and Cody both. Thanks to those guys. Big thanks to a couple entities. Our partner in crime here is the Bonner Milltown History Center. We have worked with them for many, many, many years, and really appreciate their help with putting on this event and coming up with the speakers, of which Kim Brigham is one of them. We also want to thank MCAT for filming this. We really appreciate that. We'll find out when this might show up on MCAT down the line, but very much appreciate that. So today, our next speaker is Kim Brigham. I just wanted to give basically like a 2-minute history of about 10,000 years of history here at Milltown State Park. I think Scott mentioned earlier that we are on the ancestral homelands of the Salish and Kalispel people. This place for them, you know, they've known for thousands and thousands of years. The confluence of these two rivers that we call, you know, the Blackfoot and the Clark Fork, was to them known as Inaitististum, which is a Salish word meaning place of bull trout. A lot of place names were named after sources of food, and this was known back in those days. You know, these rivers have had many other names in the years since. Some folks know them as the Hellgate River, basically, and the Big Blackfoot. At any rate, the human history, that story begins with native people. And, you know, the Salish presence here, and then the road to Buffalo, which is the Blackfoot, basically. You know, tribes from the interior Columbia Basin would band together to travel to the east side to hunt bison, and they passed right through here. In much more recent history, Meriwether Lewis in 1806 on the 4th of July passed through here and followed those same indigenous routes to get back toward St. Louis. That kind of was the first Euro-American exploration of the region. It was followed in decades by French fur trappers who gave us the name for Hellgate Canyon. And then in the 1850s with John Mullen and Isaac Stevens and the whole treaty process, it was basically laying the groundwork for the world that we know here today, and which had considerable consequence for Native peoples, of course. One thing that, like John Mullen, built the Mullen Road, which connected the upper reaches of the Missouri to the upper reaches of the Columbia. Mullen and his crew camped out right there by the I-90 bridges in the 1860s. That laid the groundwork for the road, and then the railroads, and then with the railroads changed everything. That brought the industrialization of not only our mountainsides and forests, but also the rivers themselves. The first dam was built up on the Blackfoot River in the mid-1880s, and then followed about almost 20 years later by the Milltown Dam here. So producing electricity, producing wood for mills, for the mines, for railroads, all that required workers. And the workers in those days weren't always treated as well as they may be today. There's still some debate about that, I suppose. At any rate, there was a lot of labor unrest. I'm kind of fast forwarding to the time around 1917 and 1918. That was the start of World War I, so there was concern about protecting railroads and whatnot. And it was also a period of great labor agitation. The mines in Butte were organized for probably 20, 30 years before that. The woods weren't really organized until about that period. And some of the first to want to organize the woods and the woods workers was the IWW. And Scott mentioned, they were a very radical labor union for their time. Their big goal was to crash capitalism and bring, one big union, and the workers would run the world. Don't know whatever really came of that, but at any rate, they were active in the Bonner Milltown area about that time period. And so today's talk with Kim Brigham is going to focus on something that may or may not have happened. We're going to kind of explore that maybe as a group. But I wanted to do a quick intro for Kim. Kim is a graduate of the Bonner School and Sentinel High and the University of Montana. He spent a career working for the Missoulian. They often talk about journalism being the first draft of history. Kim definitely embodies that spirit. He's been real involved with local history efforts here for a long, long time and is a key part of the Bonner Milltown History Center. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Kim.
And maybe I could turn it over to Goldie to start handing out your assignments. You got homework here. Actually, a little what he'll be handing out, if you're interested, is what I'm calling an evidence sheet, that we will weigh different pieces of evidence to see if we all agree or disagree that there was what we call the Wobbly Massacre here in roughly 1917. We'll talk about the time frame as well. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Good. I will try to not mumble. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, socialists, capitalists, proletariat, and bourgeoisie. I too welcome you to, on behalf of the Bonner Milltown History Center and Museum. We've got our start about in 2007, actually, is where our center dates back to. And at that time, as years went on, we established a base in our tiny little office over by the Bonner Post Office. And it's just jam-packed full of marvelous artifacts, some of which are on display right here. And I urge you all to take a look at them, as well as the photographs, some of which I'd never seen before, and that we have on the tables over here. At the time we got our start in 2007, Bonner was in bad shape. It looked like the mill was disappearing and the houses along with it. And it's good to see 14 years later that both of those situations have been corrected. It's now a burgeoning mill site with, I think, something like 17 businesses operating. The mills have been, or the houses, more than 40 houses have been restored. People are living in them, and they're making new memories of the homes that have been making memories for more than 100 years in a lot of cases. And of course, we got music in Bonner these days. I think there's 27 concerts scheduled this summer at the Kettle House Amphitheater, and the one tonight, the Steve Miller Band, is number 22 of those. And I kind of chuckle. I had to Google the Steve Miller Band. They cut their first album when I was in 6th grade at Bonner School. And the way we date that in Bonner is they've survived the Anaconda Company era, the U.S. Champion era, U.S. Plywood Champion era, and Stimson era, and apparently they're still going strong. What I got a kick out of their first album that they cut in 1968 was, the title song was, and I'm going to get this right here, "We Are the Children of the Future." It says, "Wonder where this world is going to. We are the children of the future. Wonder what in this world we're going to do." 1968. So they're making this album at the time Martin Luther King was assassinated. It comes out the month before Robert Kennedy was assassinated, and 2 months before the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, which had fireworks of its own. So 2 years later, my 8th grade teacher, Mrs. Dufresne, teaches us a song to sing for graduation. It was, unlike the Steve Miller Band's song, which was, I guess you'd call it psychedelic, this was decidedly unpsychedelic by the Up With People. And that song was, "Gee, I'm looking forward to the future, 'cause in the distance I can see a great new day is dawning in the 21st century." I still remember it by heart. But I progressed. Your name is Joe, and you woke up. You didn't wake up. You were eating dinner last night at your home in Spokane when you got a phone call. Afterwards, you packed your stuff, you kissed your wife goodbye, you hugged your children, you headed down to the depot and hopped the midnight train to Milltown. Now you're passing through Missoula just before dawn, and they start handing out you and the 40 to 50 other members of the Burns Detective Agency sawed-off shotguns. And as you're pulling into Milltown, the train is slowing down. You tap down your derby hat, you tighten your ties, you make sure you got your billy club ready to go, and you all get up and start heading for the door. Or you're in the Wobbly Camp right up here in Milltown, just waking up. You can see your breath from your sleeping bag when you poke your head out, and you have had a restless night, tossing and turning. You had a busy day yesterday. You were at the gates of the mill, handing out red cards to those who were interested in joining the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, and organizing and in support of the lumber camp strike that's going on. Your name, by the way, is Josephine, and you have a fervent supporter of the wobbly movement. Your mother was a tailor, let's say. Your father was a gambling man down in New Orleans. You've always been raised to be a supporter of the working people. Did you get the reference? The House of New Orleans. Now, the train, you wake up and you're kind of sleepily listening to a train pull in right by your camp on the tracks at the Bonner station. And meanwhile, Joe is on the train as it pulls to a halt. He and the other swarthy, burly, whatever you want to be, Burns detective agents jump off the train, and the rest is history or mystery. Our idea today is to kind of figure out the difference between the two. And so if you have your handouts, did everybody that wanted one get a handout? You'll notice that we've got exhibits on them. And let me take you quickly through the whole thing. Page 1 is the Exhibit A and Exhibit B that this whole thing stems out of. Page 2 should be page 4, but it's easier to handle because we got to keep turning back and forth maybe. At the end, I'm hoping to get some input on whether you think this thing actually happened, and if not, what did actually happen that would prompt John Toole, who's Exhibit A and B, to write about it. We'll talk a little bit on page 3 about who and where and when, and then at the back sheet will talk about a little bit more exhibits to determine whether we think this thing happened or not. This was a big deal. I mean, it's a fun story 100 years later, but it may or may not have entailed a lot of mayhem and violence, maybe more so than any in the IWW episodes during World War I. So, if you look at Exhibit A, we've got two accounts of this massacre, the only two that exist, both written by John H. Toole, former mayor of Missoula, and one was in the book The Baron. I had to check this out from the library because they are out of print, although I'm told that they're by Mountain Press that published them. John Reimel says that they're preparing to put them back into print on demand in a paperback edition, just so you know. Great book if you're interested at all in the history around here. A lot of stories, and some of them may be true. That's The Baron, the Logger, the Miner, and Me, published in 1984. In 1989, coincidentally, the year that John Toole died, he came out with Red Ribbons, a story of Missoula and its newspaper. And in both books, like I say, this account of the so-called Wobbly Massacre occurred. And so I want to take a quick look at the difference between the accounts and the similarities. But you'll notice in Exhibit A, it's the only place where he gives his source of what this happened. And that source came from Yum Karkinen, who's somewhat of a legend out here in Bonner. And we'll talk a little bit about him. But he was an 11-year-old boy when this probably happened. And in the italics down at the bottom, it says, "Your granddad sent a telegram to the Burns Detective Agency in Spokane. These fellows were strike breakers. Big, tough men, and they wore derby hats. They hit the Wobbly camp before daybreak. They carried billy clubs and guns. The Wobblies never knew what hit them. The Burns men waded through camp, beating up the Wobblies and setting fire to the shacks. They shot a fellow who was called the Silver-Tongued Orator. He never made another speech. He got shot in the throat, and the Wobblies took off in all directions. So that was about all that he included in The Bear and the Logger, the Miner, and Me. In Exhibit B, Red Ribbons, there's a lot more details. He says in this book that it was in early 1918. He says the Wobblies built a shack town near the county road a quarter mile east of Milltown. He says that Kenneth Ross, the manager of the mill, could see the IWW shack town from his office window. And he talks about the Burns men succeeded in killing or wounded between 21 and 30 men. Now that is the only sentence probably that brings us here today. It's the only sentence that says anybody was killed in the incident. And I'm including not just John Toole's literature, but that of a century's worth of IWW literature as well. And we'll get into that a little bit later. He also says that there at the bottom that Kenneth Ross sent his men, Anaconda, down the Milwaukee tracks, which were the big Blackfoot Railway that went up the Blackfoot, and buried the victims. And the graves of the IWW men were located 60 years later near Piltsville, Montana. Now I'm hoping there's people in here that can fill in some gaps for me, but these are the exhibits that I've got. So if you want to turn to page 3, actually, talk a little bit about the players. Kenneth Ross died in 1933. He was the longest serving and most influential manager of the Bonner Mill. Because of Kenneth Ross, the lumber camps, the conditions in the lumber camps did improve. He didn't credit the Wobblies for improving them. John Toole, the writer of those books, was Kenneth Ross' grandson. And he was a Missoula businessman. He was the vice president of the Montana Constitutional Convention in 1972 and appointed mayor after Bill Craig died in 1983 and served in that capacity for a couple of years. Yum Karkinen, born in 1906, he died in 1978. He lived, as far as I know, his whole life out here in the Bonner area. And like I say, he was somewhat of a legend. There's a lot of Yum Karkinen stories because he was in charge of security for Bonner as a Missoula County deputy. And so the hooligans of Bonner can tell stories about trying to outwit Yum Karkinen, and sometimes they did, I guess. Unfortunately, our main hooligan was one of our main storytellers from the History Center, Glenn Max Smith, a longtime worker at the mill who grew up in Bonner, but I don't see him here. A quick note on the Burns Detective Agency. They were actually formed in 1909, and they became the rivals of the Pinkertons in terms of national detective agencies. And they were known for their strike-breaking activities. One of their offices was in Spokane, but they actually had international offices throughout the United States and other countries. Headed by William Burns, nicknamed America's Sherlock Holmes. At this time in World War I era, William Burns not only ran his international detective agency, a private enterprise that obviously got hired to take care of heads that needed broken, but he was also the head of the Bureau of Investigation for the United States government. That was a position that Alan Pinkerton, is that right? Alan Pinkerton? Whoever was the Pinkerton. William Burns succeeded Alan Pinkerton, and he preceded in what became known as the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover. So he was running a private detective agency and the Federal Bureau of Investigation simultaneously when this happened. As far as I know, he never made it to Missoula or to Bonner. That last item, silver-tongued orator, I was kind of reluctant to put it on there because when Yum Karkkonen's account said that he got the silver-tongued orator got shot in the throat and never made another speech, I scrambled I Googled everywhere to find a silver-tongued orator, and that was a common and probably mostly derisive term used back in those days. William James Jennings Bryant was known as a silver-tongued orator. But I did find one reference to a guy named Ragnar Johansson. He was newly joined the IWW after coming here from Sweden. He was one of those arrested during this time, 1917, 1918, and put on trial with Big Bill Haywood, the head of the IWW in Chicago. And he was convicted, Ragnar Johansson was, which seems to indicate he could still talk, I think. He might not have been the one who was shot, but he was in Butte just before the lynching of Frank Little, the other IWW leader, on August 1st, 1917. And they apparently had a discussion who was going to stay with the miners' strike in Butte and who was going to go to the lumber camps in western Montana. And Ragnar Johansson drew the lumber camps and thereby saved his life. So that's the who, the key players. We move on to the where. Where might this have happened? Where was the wobbly incident, as we'll call it? And I've got a really makeshift map that I hurried up and made last night and this morning, and it's much too busy to be seen from that distance. But I'll point out a couple of places that I'm going to talk about right here. This is you want to move it over just a little bit. We are here at the Confluence Park. And here's the rivers, of course. The wobbly camp, as it's going to be described in some of these exhibits, was down here. And if you look towards Bonner, you see that blue water tower? From the descriptions that we've got, and these aren't necessarily conclusive, but the Wobblies were camped alongside the railroad, just past that blue water tower, and near what was then the Bonner Depot. The section house still stands, and are the Clarks here today? I talked to the people that live in there yesterday, and they have their own ideas of where the camp was, but they have a good sense of the history too, so that might throw my calculations off a little. But the exhibits of where, and I don't know if we need to, well, okay, let's in our history book of Bonner, a grassroots tribute, Gene Radigan wrote that the IWW had a camp across the Northern Pacific tracks along the Clark Fork River between the upper end of Milltown and the Milwaukee Bridge. The difference between Milltown and Bonner, does everybody know that? It causes a lot of conversation, I guess, but as you're traveling from Missoula and you get off the interstate, before you cross the river right here before you cross the Blackfoot River. You've got Town Pump and River City Grill, etc. That's known as West Riverside because it's west of the river. You cross the river into Milltown, which used to be, way back, even before this time, was known as Riverside, but they couldn't call the post office Riverside because Marcus Daly had Riverside down by Hamilton already. So they had to name it something else, and they called it Milltown. So Milltown is just beyond the bridges here. And then as you go around the corner to the mill, the actual mill town of Bonner, the churches, the school, and the whole mill complex, that would be Bonner. So we're talking Milltown mainly. So there were, Gene Radigan wrote, there were a lot of jack pine trees in that area, and it is reported that there were perhaps 100 men camped there, cooking their meals over open campfires. Now that's as far as she went in terms of any incidents that happened there. She didn't mention any incidents, but she gave the location. So as you come across the bridge, you would cross the railroad tracks over to what used to be Harold's Club, is now Milltown Moose Club, and then roll on down the dirt road, bumpy dirt road, past, there's a community gardens and the water tower that you can see from here. And a quarter of a mile past that, past the last house in Milltown right now, is almost to that section house, which has a lot more trees than I realized until I drove over there yesterday. So she says it was, there were a lot of jack pine trees. John Toole had a couple of other geographical descriptions. He said a tent camp just below the Bonner Mill. Well, that's pretty broad. He said that near the county road, a quarter mile east of Milltown. And he said that Kenneth Ross could see the IWW Shacktown from his office window. So in consulting with the historians of the mill, Kenneth Ross's office back then and the main entrance to the mill is the street that it's right over here. It's the street that we call Silk Stocking Row, where the white office building for the mill is today. The Margaret Hotel, or the park that held the Margaret Hotel, is right there. And so I measured the distance from his office at the entrance of the mill at that time over to the supposed wobbly camp, and it's about 2/3 of a mile. And right now the view is blocked by all those big buildings on the mill complex, but all of those came after the mill was mechanized, etc. And so it seems clear, and Max Smith agreed with me, that would have been visible in 1917 across the way. So now, again, I'm opening this up to discussion, and if anybody has comments or questions at any time, we don't have to wait till the end, because I'm looking for more evidence, and I'm hoping you guys can help me out. So, Mike.
So you made some mention of somebody finding remains 60 years after the fact.
Yes.
Do you know anything about that? That would have been...
The question was if we know anything about the remains being found in the basically the Piltsville area, West Piltsville, I guess you call it, 60 years after the fact, which would have been around in the 1970s. And all I know about that, and I hope there's somebody here that can add more, that was the decade that what we call Bonner Pines was developed. Before you get to the Piltsville fire station. And in the old days, that was called the Dry Farm. And that was where the train going up and down the Blackfoot staged livestock, sheep and cows, before they were taken up the valley or taken down the valley. Okay, Yum Karkinen owned, I think, the first house in Bonner Pines, and it's speculated, and somewhere out there I've heard the story, couldn't find it in the paper, that he or someone talked somebody from the university, an archaeologist maybe Carling Maloof, I don't know, to come out and look for these bones. Now, one story says he asked them to look for bones of Native Americans. Another story, including John Toole, said that they came out to look for the Wobbly bones, where the Wobblies were buried in the old dry farm. I don't know the results of that survey, if it ever happened. I do know that I couldn't find anything in Carling Maloof's papers at the university, but those have not been fully organized, as I understand it. One of the old timers in in Bonner before he died was Dick Bush. So I called him up years ago and asked him what he knew about it. And he said, yes, somebody from the university came out here. They didn't find anything. Again, I'm hoping that somebody knows more about that than I do. Okay, thank you, Judy. I'll leave this up here if anybody has some questions. For one thing, it's not to scale, I promise you.
It's a nice map, though, Tim.
Thank you. Wow.
You want me to put it in front or just over
Yeah, you want to just, that might,
What other massacres are happening in this time frame from workers and strikes and that sort of thing?
I don't know if any of them were called massacres.
Ludlow, I'm from Colorado, Ludlow massacre.
Yeah.
There were.
Okay, they call them massacres? I mean, people died.
Yeah. 20
Okay.
people died in Colorado.
So the question is, where else in the West
Yeah,
and
it's
around?
generally that time frame where they strike breakers and historically, that I want to add credence to this could have happened if things would happen.
Exactly, right. And Mike may know more. Everett, Washington had the year before this, in 1916, I believe it was,
Yeah.
had a big mess where people died. And where was it near?
Ludlow, Colorado.
Yeah.
Leadville.
Ludlow.
Ludlow.
Ludlow, Colorado.
Yeah, it was, I think in 1415.
In 1914, 1915. And was that in the mines or lumber
It
camps?
was a coal miner strike.
Coal miner strike,
Yeah.
okay.
Well, I think what made it different was they used the actual army to go in.
Oh, okay.
So that's not the private company, but
Okay, thank you. He said that they used the army to break up that camp. And there was actually, because World War I, that's probably something we should hit on. World War I started the spring of 1917. We haven't got to the when yet, but we're kind of generally assuming that it happened in the aftermath of the breakout of World War I, because lumber camps throughout the Northwest were being organized by the IWW, and there was a massive strike that was shutting down early production of airplane parts, the wood lumber that they used for airplane parts, which incidentally Kenneth Ross had a lot to do with. He was hired by the federal government to go and spruce production for airplane parts, but that wasn't until 1918. Okay.
so during that kind of 5-year period, there were incidences of violence.
Probably even before the 5-year period. But the point he's making is 1914 through 1918, 1919 was a very, volatile time. That's the word I was going to say violent, but violent work too. And most of it, a lot of it, was the IWW, but not all of it. I mean,
Similar
right.
union activity.
And you all know about the speculator mine disaster in 1917, in the summer of
Yeah, in July, it was June of 1917.
June of 1917 in Butte that killed.
165 guys. I know a lot about this. This is my senior thesis in journalism school. So we're going way back. But yeah, like Kim, I started my career in journalism, but had a very brief one compared to Kim. But so I did do a little bit of research, though, on that era, more focused on Butte. But it was this mine disaster happened, killed 165 men. There was a spontaneous strike, and then there was the company papers that covered it from their perspective. There were new papers that cropped up, the Butte Bulletin, which was kind of the voice of radical labor in those days. It was in that time period that Frank Little came to town. And Frank Little was a union or a wobbly organizer who met a very brutal death in Butte. And so you ask about were there other incidents, and so, like Frank Little's death is being studied to this day, right? So there's a great podcast called Death in the West. Check it out. They did a fantastic job looking at it from a contemporary perspective. But there's all kinds of history books written about the Wobblies, their martyrs more than anything, of which, people like Joe Hill was one of them. Scott was singing a Joe Hill song, maybe, or Joe Hill, and then Frank Little. And so the thing that makes me skeptical about this massacre is there's not a word written about it other than by the union or by the company boss.
That's right.
And so that's one thing that I'm very curious about, like why wouldn't it be part of the pantheon of wobbly heroes, basically, that we don't hear about it?
So on page 2, you can vote no.
I'm a skeptic.
With your reasons. And I will not agree or disagree with you right now, but I have my own opinions. So we come to the bottom of page 3, which is when. And one point that ought to be made is this was not during the 1917 lumber camp strikes throughout the Northwest. It was not the first appearance of the Wobblies in Bonner in the lumber camps. Now, Scott had talked about their free speech fight in 1909 in Missoula, which I think was the first one. Philip Meckling is here. He wrote the National Historic nomination for Free Speech Corner in Missoula. At the corner of Front Street and Higgins. But even before that, in 1907, I found mention in the Missoulian about the IWW struck the lumber camps of the Blackfoot for 3 weeks, and they settled amicably with the bosses of both the Bonner lumber, the Bonner mill, but others in Missoula. There was a bunch of other lumber mills, of course, back then. Anyway, 3 weeks, they settled, they got higher wages, and apparently everybody went home happy. 1913, the Wobblies were back in a camp somewhere in this area, and I'm guessing the same camp, and they hassled the workers at the gate. They called for and got 75 lumberjacks to leave the job up the Blackfoot. Kenneth Ross and his boss, the president of what was then Blackfoot Milling Company, was John R. Toole, John H.'s uncle, I guess it would have been. Anyway, they claimed that their concessions were not, again, because of the Wobblies, but that strike was settled. It lasted for 2 to 3 months, and they kept operations running by, in part, by taking men from the mill itself up to the lumber camps in the Blackfoot to keep lumber production going. And that was in 1913. So this stuff had been happening. And I'm not 100% positive that the massacre didn't happen in 1913, for instance. There's nothing that really says that. But, well, actually there is. Exhibit B starts out in early 1918, which really throws us for a loop because the Great Lumber Strike of the Northwest supposedly was settled by then. As the war kept going, early 1918 was the first signs of the Spanish flu pandemic. And so, well, maybe it happened in early 1918. But I did find this letter that Kenneth Ross wrote to his boss in New York, Con Kelly, boss of the Anaconda Company, and he was given Kelly a rundown on the labor conditions in the lumber camps throughout the Northwest because he was influential in the whole thing. And he said, Exhibit G, there's very little or no agitation going on that we know of in our immediate district right now, and it does not look as though we would likely have any serious difficulties from labor troubles this year. Now, whether he says that because he squashed him already or not, I don't know. Just 2 months later, Kenneth Ross was asked by the U.S. government to leave his job in Bonner for a while and go head up the spruce production of the lumber camps or lumber mills throughout the Northwest and Midwest, Detroit, Dayton, Ohio, etc. So he spent the rest of the war from June until the war ended in that capacity for the Department of Defense. So where does that leave us? Again, the general consensus is if this massacre happened, it happened somewhere between maybe July and November of 1917. But John Toole says early 1918. I don't have evidence to show either way. And if anybody else wants to get on Google or newspapers.com and look, or maybe some file somewhere at the university or even at our place, it has some more evidence. I don't know. So we turn to the last page, and these are just kind of the etc. evidences, and we'll skip through those. One, we came upon when the houses were being renovated in Bonner, Mike Heisey is part of the Missoula or the Bonner development or properties development. Anyway, one of the mill owners he came upon a box that was labeled 1918, and he dropped it off at the History Center. And I just went and was able to go through it, and it was filled with Kenneth Ross's memorabilia. I mean, it was just a treasure trove of stuff that kind of showed you what Kenneth Ross was doing in 1917 and 1918. Actually, his wife, Marjorie, died in 1919, and there's a whole bundle of sympathy cards or telegrams. They weren't cards back then. Letters, notes, and telegrams of sympathy, and they came from the people like A.B. Hammond in San Francisco. They came from Con Kelly in New York and J.D. Ryan in Butte. So that's a long way of introducing one of the letters. A special assistant attorney general for the Department of Justice, who was in Chicago, sent a letter or forwarded a copy of a letter that Arthur Smith, who was the leader of the IWW, as the secretary here in Missoula in 1917. And it was dated August 9th, 1917, and he was writing to Seattle to this James Rowan, who was the kind of his boss, I think, in Seattle. They nicknamed James Rowan the Jesus of Lumberjacks. And his letter said, I got a meeting together. This was in August of 1917, 1 week after the lynching of Frank Little, and just a couple weeks after the speculator mine disaster in Butte. He says, I got a meeting together here in Missoula, and they voted to buy a Gatling gun. You can't just second-hand one here. And I won't send anyone to Milltown or go myself without protection. And damn if I can buy one on $18 a week and have to move room every night. And that's how a lot of Frank Little was the same way. He never stayed the same place 2 nights in a row. So it's a violent place in the IWW's mind out here during the strike. That says, next is Exhibit I. This is an interesting point. John Toole, who wrote The Baron, The Miner, and who wrote Red Ribbons, his brother was somebody a lot of you know, was K. Ross Toole, the great historian at the University of Montana. K. Ross was also Kenneth Ross's grandson. He also wrote a lot about, in the 20th century, or in his book, The 20th Century Montana, about the Wobblies and their activities both in Butte and in the lumber camps of western Montana. And I looked everywhere I could, and there was no mention that his grandfather ordered a massacre of Wobblies in anywhere, including Milltown, Montana. Brother says one thing, the other brother says that it happened. Maybe they didn't get along. I don't know. They were definitely at odds because K. Ross Toole, I guess his legacy was about the damages mainly that the Anaconda Company and the copper collar that it held on Montana. Whereas John H. Toole, his brother, was more of a sympathizer, and really in his book he credited his grandfather with handling the unions the right way to set us on the right path into the 20th century. I may be sugarcoating that a little bit, but he also admitted that his grandfather was collared by the copper collar. So, last two exhibits. Exhibit J. During the 6-month trial of Big Bill Haywood in Chicago and 100 other Wobblies, in which Haywood was eventually convicted, sentenced. He got out in parole 3 years later, and while he was appealing, and he escaped to Russia. And the story of Big Bill Haywood is that his grave is very close to the grave of Lenin in Moscow in Red Square. It's Big Bill Haywood. So that means a different thing in the 21st century than it did in the 20th century, but it gives you an idea. Anyway, this trial was going on, and it went on for a long time. The Wobblies published several publications in one called More Truth About the IWW, Facts in Relation to the Trial at Chicago. They cited flagrant instances in 1917 of organized violence against the IWW. And these instances included the lynching of Frank Little, things that happened in Red Lodge, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in Washington, and other states, Oregon, South Dakota, New Jersey, as wobbly activities, were nationwide basically. And they left one thing out. which is interesting. They never said a word about any kind of violence against the Wobblies in Milltown, Montana. And they were not known to be quiet, especially in the court of law, about things like that. So make that what you will. And final exhibit is from John Toole's summation of his grandfather, Kenneth Ross. In one instance, he says, Kenneth Ross makes no mention of the IWW struggles in his journal. He dictated a journal to his daughter, I may have the names wrong, in 1929, a few years before his death. And the journal is on file in the archives at the university. But his grandson says, perhaps his memories of it were painful, but it was without question his finest hour. And then, actually the page before, he said, so the hard-driving, hard-headed, uneducated man from Nova Scotia played two ennobling roles in this sad IWW affair. He vastly improved the lot of the lumberjack, and he brought labor stability to the Anaconda camps. The mills and woods of the company would not be unionized for another 24 years when the AFL-CIO finally succeeded in 1941. That came the day after Pearl Harbor. They were out here with actually a sign that's among the pictures here that was posted that the AFL wasn't the CIO at that time, but it was AFL is here, and there are probably former union members, mill union members here. Anybody belong to the union? Yeah, and several mill leaders still survive us here. So of Union Local 3038. Anyway, I'm done. I need input, and I will take questions, but I prefer answers. I thank you for coming. I ramble, and I should have said I am the preamble to our headliner today, who is Ellen Baumler. I see Ellen's here, and she'll be speaking at 3:00. And like I say, this is just a warm up, and probably a poor one at that. So thank you.
Thank you, Kim.
Yeah. Any questions on this map? Oh.
I mentioned we're going to take a short break, and
Dreamies is still here if you're looking for ice cream. We have just 1 second. We're going to have a quick word from Philip Mackling, former preservation officer for the city and county of Missoula. He's got another thing at State Park. One other quick thing, we do have a little bit of time between our next speaker. We could do a tour of the Blue Shop if anybody hasn't been out there and wanted to see some of the artifacts from the Milltown Dam powerhouse. Philip?
That's right.
Hi, this is just an update on what's going on at Fort Owen, just northwest of Stevensville. Some of you may not know that Fort Owen was built as an adobe settlement. Also, it was built by Mexicans who convinced John Owen to create a fort in the shape of a Mexican hacienda. On Saturday, the 18th, we'll be having a mud party at Fort Owen, where we will be making adobes and doing some work with Montana State Parks to see how and if the remaining adobe walls at Fort Owen should be repaired and or should be restored. So you're all invited to come if you're interested in historical stories. We have a few about John Owen and Fort Owen. It was the first settlement in western Montana, the first water right, the first land sale. It goes on, a lot of firsts. But it's from 11 until 3. It'll be going on all day. There will be various stages where you can learn about the Bitterroot history of well, a little bit about Bitterroot history, more about soils and adobe itself as a constructed as a construction material. Some of you may not know that the oldest adobe structures that have been dated go back 8,300 years. And so there's a story there too. So we'll be interested. If you're all interested, come along. We now have a nice parking lot Montana State Parks has put together, and the park manager will be there as well as some other interpreters. So you're all invited.
I'm traveling down some coal town road. Listen to my rubber tires whine. Goodbye to Buckeye and the white sycamore. I'm leaving you behind. Oh, well, I've been a coal man all my life, laid down dragging the hoe. Got a back like an ironwood, been bent by the wind, blood veins blue as the coal. Got blood veins blue as the coal. Well, somebody said that's a strange tattoo you got on the side of your head. I said that's the mark of the number 9 coal. A little more and I'd been dead. Oh, but I love the rumble and I love the dark. I love the cool of the slate. It's just traveling down them new roads and it's looking for a job. It's the traveling and looking I hate. Say the traveling and looking I hate. I stood for the unions and I've walked in the line. I fought against the company. And I stood for the UMW of A. Now who's gonna stand by me? 'Cause I got no job and I got no pay. I just got a worried lonesome soul, and this blue tattoo on the side of my head been left me by the number 9 coal. Been left me by the number 9 coal. So someday when I die and I go to heaven, the land of my dream, I won't have to worry about losing my job or the hard times or big machine. I won't have to worry my hours away about dues or hospital plans. No, I'll haul roll coal as the blue heavens roll, sing with the angel band. Be singing with the angel band. 'Cause I'm traveling down this coal town road. Listen to my rubber tires whine, and it's goodbye to Buckeye, white sycamore. I'm leaving you behind. Yeah, I'm leaving you behind. When I first came to Montana in 1974, I landed in Carbon County. Red Lodge, of course, is the county seat and was a big coal town in its day. But if you just go over the hill, you leave the alpine of Red Lodge into the semi-arid of what's really northern Wyoming at that point. And you find yourself coming down into the little ghost town of Washoe. A few miles further you come into Bear Creek, and then you get down to Belfry where it meets the Clark Fork of the Yellowstone. And it's the first time I ever got to talk to people that were coal miners. Frank Danachek was the head of the UMWA of Red Lodge, and told me the stories of Bear Creek when it was a bustling town and was busier even than Billings at the turn of the century. Mines in every coulee. And I took the occasion to write a song, again from some oral histories, that talks about Bear Creek. Here we go. We wrote some grants at that time for community development. It's 1974. And the demographics of Bear Creek was a lot of old women. And that's because there was a mine disaster there that took the lives of nearly 46 people. Not quite, in the Smith mine. And so there were lots of widows left. And this mentions a couple of things in it. Fire damp, which is the gas that seeps off of the coal seam. Black damp is the methane gas that accumulates in the mine. And there's a mention here of 'twas an 8-hour day collar to collar. And what that means is that you got paid not from the time that you started digging coal in the mine, but you got paid from the time you suited up before you went down into the mine. And that's, I think, something you have the United Mine Workers to thank. They all learned from their fathers, who taught them all well, how to mine the coal safely and how they could tell if too much fire damp from the coal faces seep. The brave Bear Creek miners worked down in the deep. Now the town of Bear Creek in 43, it was as busy a coal camp as you ever did see. For a nation at war had a hunger for coal, 3 shifts were kept working, 6 days in the hole. There was the sootless and the smokeless and the Oster Creek too, the Washoe, the Bear Creek and the Brophy mine too. But the one that's remembered that'll go down in time, nestled back in the coulees, Smith number 3 mine. It was a spring-like morning, for midwinter they'd laugh. It was a payday and a weekend meant time and a half. 77 rode the empty cars down, some 8,000 feet deep into the ground. 'Twas an 8-hour day, collar to collar, and it all seemed quite normal till somebody hollered. Then a hurricane wind filled with debris cut the power, swept the mine, cut the power, so no one could see. Up above from the shaft there rose a small cloud, just a muffled explosion, not all that loud. Other mines soon had their dread signals scream, and the fear-struck families from the coulees did stream. Miners from near and far heeded the call to rescue their brothers, though the chances seemed small. They came all the way from Butte, Roundup. Their safety lamps lit while they tested the air, 'cause they'd all drop like flies if that black damp was there. Well, the mine was a wreck. The The blast was so complete that it took round-the-clock rescuers more than a week. They put up new Bradis and guided oxygen in. Still 3 rescuers died with those other fine men. The fire damp had built up and it exploded at last. They died in the instant from the force of the blast. The others went slower as the black tramp set in. 5 made it still longer at the very far end. They did all they could to keep that dread black damp out. But when the first of them fell, there was no hope held out. On dynamite boxes and chalk on the wall, scrawled, "Farewell, wives and daughters, we've answered the call." Well, the funeral was Thursday, the snow then so deep you could just see the heads of the people who'd weep. Now 55 widows remain there to mourn, 52 children without fathers forlorn. Some say this surely was Bear Creek's dark hour. The mine remained closed, they just shut off the power. They flooded the shafts, they locked up the doors. Coal would not come from the Smith mine no more. Bear Creek's dark hour. Thank you. I've only written 2 songs and the other one's too seditious to sing here.
Thank you.
But how are we doing on time? How much?
I think we're in. Get 2:45. Got enough more, maybe?
Yeah, okay.
Scott, my dad was born in Washoe.
Sorry?
My dad was born in Washoe.
Oh, really?
My father was there at this mine that day.
Oh my God. His father was born in Washoe and was at the Smith mine that day.
Well, not my father. My grandfather was
Oh, wow.
working up top. Wasn't in the mine itself.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I remember going to a meeting of local Democrats in the Bear Creek Town Hall. There was a potluck and casseroles were shared and whatnot. And I had just arrived from Wisconsin, and this widow from the mines disaster came up and she said, "So where are you from?" And I said, "Well, I'm from Wisconsin. How about you? Are you from around here?" We're in Bear Creek. She said, "Oh no." And I said, "Where are you from?" And she said, "Washoe."
Oh yeah.
What is it, 3 miles?
It's like Milltown and Bonner and West Riverside. I mean, yeah, they're spitting distance practically.
Well, I wasn't planning to do just mining stuff, but I'm going to do a Merle Travis song that I think the world of. We sang this song in a pub in Ireland 2 years ago, and wouldn't you know that they all knew it. These are people who knew Butte America and Tom Marr, and made us feel quite welcome. And when we were given the guitars and given a chance to swap a song, we gave them this, and they sang on the chorus. You can too now, because there's just a handful. You guys, I mean, let yourself go here. Come all you young fellers, so young and so fine, and seek not your fortune way down in the mine. It'll form as a habit, seep in your soul, till the veins of your blood, they'll run black as the coal. And it's dark as a dungeon and damp as a dew, where the danger is double and the pleasure's off you, where the rain never falls and the sun never shines, and it's dark as a dungeon way down in the mine. But there's many a miner that I've known in my day, lives just to labor his whole life away. He's like a fiend with his dope or a drunkard his wine, a A man will have lust for the lure of the mind, and it's dark as a dungeon and damp as a dew, where the danger is double and the pleasures are few, where the rain never falls and the sun never shines, dark as a dungeon way down in the mine. The morning, the evening, middle of the day, they're the same to the miner who labors away, and the one who's not careful will never survive one fall of the slate, and you're buried alive. Well, it's dark as a dungeon, damp as a dew, the danger is double and the pleasure is few, where the rain never falls and the sun never shines, dark as a dungeon down in mine. Hope when I die and the ages will roll, my body will blacken and turn into coal. Then I will look down from my heavenly home and pity the miner who's digging my bones, where it's dark as a dungeon and damp as a dew, where the danger is double and the pleasures are few, where the rain never falls and the sun never shines, dark as a dungeon way down in the mine. Okay, we got time for one more, and I'm going to tell you, take a minute to just give a shout out to another labor leader, since it's Labor Day. I don't know why, but I had half a dozen friends in the labor movement who passed during the last 2 years. We never got to get together and send off in a proper way as a community. One of the fellows that I worked with there in Red Lodge ended up working for the AFL-CIO as a secretary in the national office. And I asked him about Rich Trumka. Richard Trumka was the head of the AFL-CIO until he passed just a few weeks ago. And Bob had a chance to know him and work with him. And I said I was going to be doing a Labor Day presentation. Could he help me explain to people why Richard Trumka was such a remarkable labor leader? And he wrote this. He said, the legacy of Trumka is best captured by his leadership of the United Mine Workers, UMW, during their seminal 1989 strike in the Pittston Coal Company. The company wanted to force dramatic concessions on its workers, including abandonment of established health care and pension programs. And for the first time in the modern era, striking union members were trained in nonviolent, civil disobedient action, direct action. Each time the company got a court injunction against one tactic, the strikers gamely switched to another, from roving pickets to mass demonstrations. But several months in, the company still refused to bargain with the union, and that's when, under Trumka's leadership, they broke out a dramatic new tactic: the thrilling mass occupation of the company's Mass 3 processing plant in Southwest Virginia, the largest coal cleaning and processing operation in the world. 1,000 supporters amassed at the gates before dawn one morning. 98 miners and one minister, all clad in camouflage but unarmed, marched in and took over. The 2 security guards fled. Word spread fast, and by nightfall, solidarity caravans from neighboring states had swelled the cheering crowds outside to over 2,000. Within days, the occupation turned the tide and forced Pittston back to the table. Rich Trumka rose to become the president of America's labor movement in 2009, and he held the labor movement to more progressive positions on a host of issues, in particular aligning itself with immigrant workers and a forceful advocacy for racial justice. Rest in peace, Brother Trumka. And as Joe Hill said on his deathbed note to Big Bill Haywood, don't waste your time mourning, organize. This is a wobbly song to close that's been adopted by the whole labor movement. And like many songs, they stole a common tune that everybody knew so that everybody could sing it. When the union's inspiration through the workers' blood shall run, there can be no power greater anywhere beneath the sun. And what strength on earth is weaker than the feeble strength of one? Well, the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong. It is we who plowed the prairies, dug the mines, built the cities where they trade, dug the mines and built the workshops, endless miles of railroad laid. Now we stand outcast and starving, neath the wonders that they made. But the union makes us strong, and solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Oh, the union makes us strong. They have taken untold millions that they never toiled to earn. But without our strength and muscle, not a single wheel would turn. We'll stop their haughty power with the power when we learn that the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. And the union makes us strong. Solidarity. Thank you very much.
Alrighty. Okay, how's that sound out there? Is that right? Yeah, great. Okay, for our last speaker today, we have Ellen Baumler. Ellen earned her PhD from the University of Kansas in English, Classics, and History. She was the Montana Historical Society's interpretive historian from 1992 until her retirement in 2018. She's an award-winning author of numerous books and dozens of articles on diverse Montana topics, and a 2011 recipient of the Governor's Award for Humanities. Please welcome Ellen Baumler.
Thank you, Mike. It's really nice to be here. And I do have to say that my work on humanities, my work on minorities and humanities, really, the Montana Humanities has pushed me along in that. And a couple of those folks are here today, and I do really appreciate them for that. So I'm going to explore briefly two minority groups, each that has a pretty interesting local connection to Missoula in western Montana. Asians and African American Buffalo Soldiers really helped to make Montana one of the most diverse places in the American West. And each of these two groups came to Montana for different reasons, but each left legacies that we really shouldn't forget. So I'm going to provide a brief background on each group and then explore their local contributions. And so I'm sort of dividing this talk into two parts. So Chinese were once the largest ethnic group in Montana. The very first waves came from China when gold was discovered with Sutter's Mill in 1848. They beat the 49ers, the American 49ers, by more than half a year. And they came almost exclusively from Guangdong province in southern China. And even further than that, they came from one little kind of county called Toisan. The gold rush coincided with terrible, terrible times in Guangdong. There was a population explosion, there was famine. The Taiping Rebellion that was going on right at that time took an estimated 20 million lives. And that prompted the Chinese to come to the United States to seek their fortunes to aid families back in China. So the population was overwhelmingly male, and it was also very, very temporary, or intended to be temporary. Fortune seekers never meant to stay. Their temporary intentions, their extreme differences in culture and in language really separated the Chinese from the mainstream population. New gold discoveries across the West and finally in Montana in 1862 brought Chinese over the Continental Divide into Grasshopper Creek, which soon became Bannock, and they came with the very, very first waves of miners. Chinese worked in most Montana mining camps. There are many examples of Chinese names on mining claims in Montana, and they made significant contributions to the development of Montana's natural resources. Now, a much smaller merchant class came from China to help support this large laboring class. The Chinese merchants and pharmacists and highly trained doctors came to Montana and established urban settlements. They owned businesses, they paid taxes like everybody else. And a very few of these generational families do remain here in Montana. And almost all of those Chinese folks have their roots in Toisan, which is really interesting. So by 1870, there were 2,000 Chinese in Montana, which made up 10% of the territorial population. The Chinese population reached the peak in 1890 at little more than 2,500, which included only 39 women. So you can kind of see how uneven the population was, and this, along with its transients, the population began to fall as many Chinese returned back home to China or died here because they couldn't afford to go back. In Missoula, by 1880, there was a small enclave of Chinese of about 20 individuals, and they were settling along West Front Street. That included 3 women, just 3, whose occupations are recorded as keeping house. In other places, Chinese women are categorically labeled prostitutes. We don't know if these women were, but there's probably a pretty good chance that they were. There are no merchants or professionals at this time, but most of them are cooks or laundrymen or folks who are working in hotels at that time. So the Chinese were the brunt of jokes. They were blamed for all bad events in a community like epidemics or fire. But I have to say that in Missoula, there's really less of that than there is in some other places, even in Montana. In 1883, the case of Lee Kim, who was supposedly had a case of leprosy, made the entire community cringe, but no one really blamed him, and there were no demonstrations as there could have been in other places. Kim, according to the Missoulian, had a loss of a finger and he had worked in local restaurants and a couple of hotels. And so the Missoulian reported that, there wasn't any danger to the community, but people would take exception with that in other places and really create trouble. But not here so much. And although officials continue to disagree over whether or not he really had leprosy, to Missoula's credit, as I said, there were really no demonstrations or unkind words from the mainstream population. And the Chinese community just very, very quietly raised enough money to send Kim very quietly home. By 1900, the Chinese settlement in Missoula included about 67 people and one family with 5 children. They are merchants mostly and laundrymen, and that includes one woman whose occupation is recorded as ill-famed, so you know what that is. And they were settling right along West Front Street. Here in Missoula, historic Sanborn maps, which are drawn for insurance purposes across Montana in communities. These maps begin in 1884, and we can see where the Chinese were settling along West Front Street, because there are always the buildings and the houses and barns and all of that are always marked Chinese. It's the only culture so ID'd on these maps. The other group that's always identified are prostitutes, and those buildings so associated are marked FB for female boarding. So Missoula maps clearly show the intermingling of female boarding places and Chinese. These two populations are almost always adjacent or intermingled. Both are marginalized populations, and they had a very symbiotic relationship with the Chinese and the women, because the women relied on the cheap meals of the noodle parlors, and Chinese herbalists and physicians would give them birth control and treatments for venereal diseases that Western doctors just didn't deal with. Chinese merchants relied on the women then for business, and that's true elsewhere as well as in Missoula. So there were Montana laws that targeted the Chinese, but the Federal Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 had the most serious impact. It was the first federal law that targeted a specific ethnic group, and it was extended until its repeal in 1943. So the law said that no skilled or unskilled laborers could come to the United States from China. And then there was an annual federal quota of only 105 professional Chinese, which left very, very little room for families to immigrate. Across the West, as placer mining played out, many Chinese miners were left idle without the money to return home, and so the Northern Pacific then offered new opportunity. In 1879, actually on the very cusp of the Exclusion Act, Northern Pacific President Henry Villard recruited between 15,000 and 17,000 Chinese from the United States, from Canada, and direct from China to help lay the tracks from St. Paul to Portland. It was brutal, brutal work, and the Chinese were paid half of what their white counterparts made. As many as 1,000 Chinese workers died of blasting accidents, disease, wrecks, and scurvy due to poor diet. One reporter noted that the Northern Pacific was indeed paved with the bones of Chinamen. Most Chinese crews worked especially from the West Coast to the east, to the meeting of the tracks at Independence, which is halfway between Missoula and Helena. As the work crews approached the Idaho-Montana border at Cabinet Landing from the west, many more Chinese crews were then brought in. And we have more information about the line camps from Cabinet Landing to the Flathead Reservation than we have anywhere else, thanks to some fairly recent archaeology. At Cabinet Landing, which was a very convenient place for the delivery of supplies because of the body of water there, there was this huge boom town that sprang up overnight, and it was packed with tents and shanties. Estimates suggest between 2,300 and 2,600 Chinese, and then several thousand others, mostly Italians and Irish workers, encamped there. The camp was a dangerous, vice-ridden place with numerous brothels, gambling houses, and some 33 saloons that were filled with unsavory characters, for sure. Cabinet Landing is the most extensively excavated Chinese railroad encampment in the region, and archaeology has shown that whites and Chinese were very strictly segregated, and they can tell by the distinctly different groupings of tableware and cutlery and manufactured goods, which I think is pretty interesting. So Cabinet Landing suddenly became a ghost town as many more Chinese laborers were hired. Section Foreman J.L. Hallett relied heavily on the Chinese labor. He supposedly cared very little about the living conditions of these workers, but he agreed to move the saloons and the brothels to follow the advancing crews throughout western Montana. The entourage of whites and Chinese under Hallett was nicknamed Hallett's Army. The press warned those in the construction path to be wary of the impacts of this transient, vice-ridden work camp. It was sort of like the gold rush, but also sort of like the oil boom in eastern Montana and northern North Dakota. So Hallett's army worked its way east from the spring of 1882 toward Missoula. Cabinet Landing, as I said, became a ghost town. Saloons and gambling houses and brothels moved with the tracks. They spent very little time in one place, and by July of 1882, there were perhaps 4,000 Chinese laborers in western Montana. That's twice the entire Chinese population of Montana Territory, according to the 1880 census. Chinese were not always buried along the railroad grade, although many of them were, but there were deaths at just about every camp. And into the 20th century, local residents periodically came upon forgotten Chinese remains. Typically, the Chinese were forced to camp in the most swampy, mosquito-ridden, infested places. They pitched their tents opening to the water and fished to supplement their poor diet, which consisted mostly of preserved goods. The artifacts that were recovered include like fishing reels, medicine bottles, and certainly opium paraphernalia. Opium paraphernalia is probably the most common artifact. Artifact. It was backbreaking work, and these folks were, rather small statured. They were not used to the climate, and there was no aspirin until 1893. So it's the only way, really, they could ease their aches and pains. And opium, of course, is in their, opium is in their culture, and they handled their opium certainly better than the Italians and Irishmen handled their booze, and that's for sure. So when the crews began to approach Flathead, the Flathead Reservation, Peter Ronan, who was the Indian agent at the time, was really concerned about this vice-ridden, all these saloons and brothels and things crossing the reservation. And so he didn't allow the workers to cross the reservation. Instead, he hired Mormon workers, and they laid the tracks across the Flathead Reservation. Chinese crews were waiting on the other end and took over once again and were at work along the Clark Fork here around Missoula. There are photographs of Chinese laborers fishing to supplement their poor diet. So there was a feverish race to complete the last miles between the east and the west at Independence. Chinese from the west competed with Euro-American crews from the east. The Caucasians reached the finish line first, but the Chinese arrived 5 minutes later. So we have this wonderful artifact at the Montana Historical Society that really does tell a very poignant story. And it comes from Missoula, and it was donated by some unknown person, but we know that the artifact belonged to a Chinese railroad laborer named Ah Hei. He likely carried this pouch on his journeys. The pouch is about this big. It's beautifully, beautifully embroidered. And the thing that's interesting about it is that it came with its contents completely intact. It included a comb, a flint case used for making fire, and a few good luck coins, and one letter to Ah Hei from his brother in China. It must have been a prized possession because all of the contents survived intact. But the letter is to the brother saying, we don't really care about making a fortune. What we really care about is you just making enough money to buy a ticket home and hurry as fast as you can so that mother doesn't have to worry about you anymore. And unfortunately, Ah Hei probably never did make it home. Now, if you visit the state capitol in Helena, the painting at the head of the grand staircase depicts the meeting of the East and West tracks at Independence in 1883. Not a single Chinese in that painting. The Chinese legacy in Montana is full of myths and misperceptions. Missoula and most communities have stories of Chinese tunnels. I'm sure you all have heard those stories. It's a very hard concept for people to let go of. Nikki Manning's book called The Missoula Underground, that was written after Dr. Kelly Dixon at the U of M conducted a summer field school in the underground system at Missoula, found absolutely no evidence of Chinese occupation there. And truly, tunnels do not leave a cultural footprint. There are mining tunnels too, in neighborhoods all over Montana, and abandoned mines all over the West, and there are steam heating systems all over our urban areas. However, none of these actually carry evidence that they are Chinese. Lots of people use tunnels, including the Chinese, but tunnels per se are a complete and total myth. That's just one of the myths. So after the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, when the Great Northern Railway and the Milwaukee Road were constructed and all the lines were refurbished in the 1890s and into the 20th century, Japanese workers were imported instead of Chinese. Many communities had hundreds and hundreds of Japanese railroad workers, and like the Chinese, they never intended to stay here. The 1900 census pages record Japanese working as laborers, and the work was just as hard and just as brutal. The Missoula City Cemetery has a Japanese section set aside with some 500 Japanese railroad workers buried there who died of accidents and disease between about 1900 and 1920. The 1910 census shows more than 300 Japanese railroad workers at Missoula, living in boxcars down by the railroad tracks. And in comparison, at that point, there are about 68 Chinese along West Front Street. So the Asian legacy really remains very little understood, but we're making some progress, at least in recognizing the important contributions that this ethnic group made. So now I'm going to turn to African Americans, especially the Buffalo Soldiers who were stationed here at Fort Missoula, just from the 19th century into shortly into the 20th century. So I'll have just a little bit of background first. In 1866, Congress provided employment for freed slaves by mandating the formation of 6 segregated black units, the 9th and 10th Cavalry regiments and the 4th and 4 infantry regiments. Restructuring and consolidating of those original infantry units into the 24th and 25th Infantry occurred in 1869. So these 4 regiments comprised about 9% of the Army in the 19th century and 20% of the Army in the West. Black soldiers typically served on the frontier, away from centers of population and political scrutiny. They guarded, protected, and served in a number of capacities. Those who were homeless and or displaced by the Civil War could find security and a career in the military, and with an honorable discharge, they could get civilian employment. But even as late as World War II, segregation was the norm, and black soldiers were often treated with disrespect, given insufficient food and clothing, and usually the worst living situations. So white officers commanded these regiments, and there were often racist undertones. The 25th Infantry and the 10th Cavalry served long in Montana at most of Montana's forts, and the 24th Infantry and portions of the 9th Cavalry also served in the state. Plains Indians gave the name Buffalo Soldiers to the men of the 9th and 10th Cavalry because of their curly black hair, but after a time, the name later became synonymous with all 4 of the black regiments. The first black troops arrived in Montana in 1888. The regiment headquarters, the band, and 4 companies of the 25th Infantry exchanged places with the 3rd Infantry that had been garrisoned at Fort Missoula. 4 more other companies moved to Fort Shaw and 2 to Fort Custer. Buffalo soldiers served at almost all of Montana's forts, and most of them were transplanted from the Indian campaigns of the hot Southwest. Montana's colder climate was difficult. It was a difficult transition, and these men made contributions really for which they are hardly remembered. I'm going to concentrate on Fort Missoula's soldiers, but we could probably spend all afternoon discussing the contribution of the men at the other forts. So in addition to their regular duties and drills, Fort Missoula's 25th Infantry's twice answered calls for help. Once to quell an uprising on the Flathead Reservation in 1889, and once answering settlers' pleas for protection from vagabond reservation Indians and Canadian tribes near Demersville, which is the forerunner of Kalispell, in 1890. Up there, Montana's wild, isolated settings added to the problems. Homesteaders and Native American tribes that lived together had long struggled at times to live peacefully. And so in February of 1890, to quiet unrest among the residents who were fearful of raiding tribes, 47 black infantrymen from Fort Missoula marched to Demersville, where they were garrisoned on the outskirts of the community for about 6 months. At the same time, 45 white men were deputized as members of a posse that controlled the community, and sometimes that was pretty infamous, I guess. But it was an unsettled time for everyone, and the black troops had a real calming effect on the community. Montana communities generally received the black troops favorably. Missoula especially fell in love with the talented musicians of the 25th Infantry Band that were stationed here between 1888 and 1898. The fabulous performances were in demand in other Montana communities, and by this time Montana wasn't quite so isolated with the railroad linking far-flung places together, and so it allowed the band to travel across Montana. The 25th Band even played at the funeral of C.P. Higgins in Missoula in 1889, marching ahead of the very prominent Masons. A number of those musicians went on to become prominent in the music world. One of them was trumpet player Albert Williams, who was a New Yorker. You guys still hear me okay? He was a New Yorker who enlisted and re-enlisted and spent a decade at Fort Missoula. He then accompanied the band to Cuba in 1898 during the Spanish-American War. Military bandmasters or leaders were always white, but Albert became the very first black formally appointed band leader around 1906 after he had left the fort, and later taught at Columbia Academy and Conservatory of Music in Washington, D.C. Another fellow band member, John Norton, who served also about the same time in Missoula, became a bandmaster at about the same time, 1906. Trombone player Angus Hayes arrived at Missoula with the 25th. He was assigned to the band, and Angus traveled across Montana and fell in love with the state. He never returned, but after service he founded an opera company in D.C. and headed the local musicians union, making sure his daughter Nina was proficient at the organ and piano. Nina went on to become a talented piano player in Chicago who jammed with Louis Armstrong, Count Basie, Nat King Cole, and other famous musicians. Remembering her father's wonderful stories about Missoula and Montana, she moved to Hungry Horse in the 1970s, where she became a regular performer at the Rocco Club there and at the Lion's Den in Kalispell. She died in Kalispell in 2003 at the age of 92. In 1891, Reverend Theophilus Gould Stewart was appointed regimental chaplain of the 25th Infantry with the rank of captain. Reverend Stewart was the very first black chaplain in the American military. Stewart was not previously in the military, nor did he seek that out, but the offer was generous and the Stewarts had a very large family. So the job came with a salary of $1,500 a year, a house and board, a horse, one servant, adequate pay raises, and a substantial pension. Fort Missoula was his first assignment, and he was here for about 8 or 9 years. When the Reverend and his family first arrived, the white regimental commanding officer, Colonel George L. Andrews, and his wife took the family in. Mrs. Andrews took the Reverend downtown and introduced him to all of the Missoula merchants. Throughout his tenure, soldiers and officers at the fort treated the Stewarts with utmost respect. However, that was not always the case elsewhere, and even in Missoula, there was one racially motivated incident that reveals that color in Missoula was an issue. He'd been invited to dinner with a colleague who was staying at the Florence Hotel, and the dining room staff denied the Reverend a seat. They said that if he were welcomed at a table, all the other guests would leave. So Reverend Stewart's white commanding officer backed him up and went with him to the Florence Hotel to confront the owner. The Reverend was a cultured and literate gentleman and wrote several letters to Montana newspapers making this issue public. The Florence apologized and offered an invitation to Reverend Stewart, but it may have been a superficial gesture acknowledging the economic benefits the fort brought to the community and really not a case of erasing color lines. Stewart was an important African American voice at Fort Missoula, but also nationally. He was a prolific writer. He wrote books and articles and editorials. He wrote for Harper's Weekly. He wrote for the Christian Recorder and other publications. He was highly educated, ordained an African Methodist Episcopal minister at the age of 20, and later earned his Doctor of Divinity. In addition to his regular duties at Fort Missoula, he offered lectures for women. He counseled the men and started a school for all enlisted men, teaching many uneducated soldiers how to read and write. Closing of the school term in 1896-97 saw 47 graduates. Reverend Stewart served as principal, and the classes that he organized were especially designed for those whose schooling had been neglected or even non-existent before joining the Army. Reverend Stewart believed his ability to ride a horse, shoot a bird on the wing, drive a mule, walk long distances, and hit a bullseye at 1,000 yards helped him gain the respect of his fellow soldiers. He took every advantage to be a fisherman among men, and he realized that there were many ways to fish for men. Although his own lineage included white ancestors, he was always an advocate for African Americans and tolerance, which he fought for all of his life. He and his first wife, Elizabeth, were the parents of 8 sons, some of whom were with the Reverend during his tenure at the fort. Elizabeth died in 1892 at Missoula, and one son attended the University of Montana while his father was stationed at the fort, and also followed his father, graduating from Wilberforce School of Divinity in Ohio. Several sons also saw military service. Reverend Stewart married his second wife, Dr. Susan McKinney, in 1896 while he was stationed at Fort Missoula. She was the nation's first African American female physician. During the 1890s, 3 companies of the 25th, Troops D and H of the 10th Black Cavalry, and 1 company of the White 20th Infantry were garrisoned at Fort Missoula. In 1894, the 25th Infantry at Fort Missoula formed a regimental baseball team. Pitcher Dalbert Green was the key organizer of the 25th team at the fort. In their leisure time, they played gilt-edged ball on Sundays and holidays, wearing makeshift uniforms. The men practiced on their own time and were not allowed to let their duties interfere with the games. Playing was a privilege, and also it was a useful disciplinary tool. Between 1894 and 1898, the team became legendary among the other Army teams. Green, who was a master sergeant, went on to earn a certificate of merit for bravery in the Philippines and continued to play with the team while they were stationed overseas. Missoula's 25th Infantry team became the seed of the Kansas City Monarchs 25 years later in the 1920s. 6 of the later members of the 25th were part of the Monarchs' first team, commonly called the Army team after the ball players of the 25th. The Monarchs were the longest-running franchise in baseball's Negro leagues. On the 4th of July in 1895, 20 soldiers of the 25th gave a demonstration of their bicycle skills. The soldiers had been practicing, and the demonstration was something entirely new to Missoula. While the community was kind of used to seeing the soldiers riding between the fort and downtown, this demonstration included the use of firearms while riding, and the crowd was enthralled. The Army's use of bicycles had begun to catch on, and the novel demonstration was a prelude to the forming of the famous Bicycle Corps. So in 1896, white officer Lieutenant James Moss organized the 25th Infantry Bicycle Corps to test the military's potential use of bicycles. The Corps undertook several short journeys. They went up the Bitterroot Valley by bicycle to deliver dispatches. They rode north to the St. Ignatius area and through Yellowstone National Park before they made their famous 1,900-mile trip from Fort Missoula to St. Louis in 1897. Carrying tents, tent poles, clothing, and rations, their heavy steel bicycles and accessories weighed an average of 59 pounds each. They pedaled at least 10 hours every day for 41 days, over snow-dusted peaks and across the sweltering Great Plains. They pushed the bikes uphill, they carried them over rivers, and rode on the train tracks when the bad roads were at their worst. They suffered thirst, hunger, cold, heat, lack of sleep, and dysentery from alkali-poisoned water. When they finally arrived at St. Louis, 1,000 civilian bicyclists rode out to meet them and escorted them to town in triumphant celebration of their really remarkable feat. The Army concluded, though, that while the bicycle offered limited military potential, it would never replace the horse. The 25th Infantry returned to Missoula by train. So when the Spanish-American War broke out in 1898, the 25th was one of the very first units called to fight. The regiment served bravely in Cuba and the Philippines. Reverend Stewart wrote about their departure from Missoula. He said, "Many were the compliments paid officers and men by the good people of Missoula, none perhaps more pleasing than that furnished by a written testimonial to the regret experienced at the departure of the regiment, signed by all the ministers in the city." All 4 black regiments transferred to Florida for training and then deployed to Cuba and participated in the capture of Santiago. Reverend Stewart was reassigned and did not accompany the men to Cuba, but he and his family did travel to Florida with them on the train. Once their train cars crossed Kentucky, the men began to experience extreme prejudice that they had never experienced in Montana. They were shocked at the many whites-only signs. At Nashville, the Reverend and his family were not allowed in the dining car, nor allowed to take meals with the other soldiers. At Chattanooga, the regiment had to travel in a separate Jim Crow car. These personal experiences and the rise of Jim Crowism, lynchings, and disenfranchisement led Reverend Stewart, despite his own white ancestors, to write a shockingly scathing assessment. I even hesitate to read this, but I'm going to anyway. He said, "White men are ever against the elevation of others. They corrupt, deprave, and degrade wherever they go, because they have so many bad men among them, and their bad men are so bad." So the 25th never did return to Missoula after the war, but was reassigned elsewhere. Other Buffalo soldiers served briefly at the fort after 1900. One famous black soldier assigned to Fort Missoula after the Spanish-American War was Horace Bivens. He was born in Virginia, a free ancestry, formally educated at Hampton Agricultural Institute and Wayland Seminary. Bivens enlisted in the 10th Cavalry in 1887 under an order that enlist educated men of color as non-commissioned officers. He served in Arizona in the Indian campaigns against Geronimo and kept the telegraph lines guarded and in good repair. He was transferred to Fort Custer with the 10th Cavalry G Company, and Bivens then served in both Cuba and the Philippines. At the attack on San Juan Hill, Bivens, who was then a sergeant, operated one of the heavy Hotchkiss guns by himself. Each shot rebounded 6 to 8 feet, and Bivens had to reposition and reload every time. After firing a number of times, the gun was no longer serviceable, so he took up a carbine and went among Colonel Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders, fighting along with them until the battle was over. Historians today know that had it not been for those black troops, Roosevelt and his men would have been exterminated. Roosevelt gained all the glory and, rather falsely, built his career on this military prowess. In 1925, Bivens, who had reached the rank of captain, received the Silver Star for his actions at Santiago during the Battle of San Juan Hill. Bivens' record for marksmanship stood until the 1970s, and today remains one of the all-time highest. During his 32-year career in the military, Bivens received 32 medals, one for every year of service. Bivens served several years as ordnance sergeant in charge of supplies and munitions at Fort Missoula. His signature and the serial number of his specially made rifle can be found in the powder house. I think it's interesting that I just stumbled across this little tidbit that Bivens married in 1889 while he was serving in Arizona, but apparently his wife abandoned him, and in January 1904 he filed for divorce in Missoula County so that he could remarry. The divorce was granted. I mean, he could have just married this woman without going to all that trouble. But anyway, he did the right thing, and he remarried, and he and his new wife made their first home at Fort Missoula. In 1906, an unfortunate event cast a blight over the entire far-famed 25th Infantry. One of the key members of the Bicycle Corps had been First Sergeant Mingo Sanders, who was an enlisted man, who by 1897 was a 16-year Army veteran. Although partially blind from an explosion, Sanders was in charge of the logistics of the bicycle adventure. He had an excellent service record and the respect of his commanding officers. In 1898, the 25th distinguished themselves fighting alongside Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders at the Battle of San Juan Hill. And in fact, Roosevelt asked Mingo Sanders to share his men's food rations with the hungry Rough Riders, which he did. Sanders later served in the Philippine insurrection and received the Medal of Honor for his heroic actions. Then in 1906, Sanders, stationed at Fort Brown, Texas, was a year away from retirement and collecting his well-deserved pension. He and 166 others of the 25th Infantry were falsely accused of murdering a white bartender. Fabricated evidence and President Roosevelt's political agenda led to their dishonorable discharge without a trial, known as the Brownsville Affair. 14 of the men were allowed to re-enlist, but 153 others, including Mingo Sanders, who was blind in one eye and diabetic, and gave most of his life to his country, and even shared his scant rations with Roosevelt and his men, never received his pension. He died in 1929 during the amputation of a gangrenous foot. The Brownsville affair is the only documented case of mass punishment in the history of the United States Army. Decades later, in 1972, Congress reopened the case and found all the men innocent. They all received honorable discharges, but at that time, only one was left living. So Fort Missoula has seen some famous names, Reverend Stewart, Mingo Sanders, Horace Bivens, and others. And although the Buffalo Soldiers' history was over by about 1910 or so, the history of the fort was not yet over. However, I have to leave it to others to tell the rest of that story. Thank you. So I'd be glad to answer questions if anyone has any. Probably some of you know more about the fort than I do. So. Yeah.
I had a question. Do you know about the bicycle route that they would have taken from Fort Missoula to Yellowstone?
They went to Helena. They went from Missoula to Helena, probably along the route that the highway follows.
So
I would
they would have passed through here.
They followed the train tracks.
Uh-huh.
Yep. So they would have passed right through here.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah.
Well, according to the local paper, they were expected to go over the road at but for some reason, the first day out, went left the east end and went over to Orlando and then to Toledo. And then,
Yeah.
they never explained why they changed the route.
Well, I think there was. It seems to me that I read there was some washout or something. I don't know exactly what it was, but something like that deterred them. Yeah. Other questions or comments? Yeah.
Is it true there's a Chinese cemetery in the lower Rattlesnake? Do you know anything about that?
It's not a Chinese cemetery. The first city cemetery was there between Cherry and what is the other? Cherry and can't think of the other street. But you can see the headboards on an 1875 perspective map right at the base of Mount Jumbo. So no, it wasn't a Chinese cemetery. However, after the cemetery was abandoned and the Missoula Cemetery was opened in about 1884. There are Chinese burials there after that. But yeah, I wouldn't call it a Chinese cemetery. In fact, I know that there was one grave that was discovered, and the coffin had no remains in it, but neatly folded clothing, and a burial brick, which noted the name of the person, so we know who it was. And that person's remains had been sent back to China, which was the custom. Most people were buried here hoping that they would, that their remains would be sent back. Didn't always happen, but yeah. So there are a few Chinese burials there for sure.
Okay.
Yeah. You have to look at my book on cemeteries, The Life of the Afterlife.
Ah.
Yes. Anybody else? Well, yeah.
Just add another contemporary connection to the story of the Black infantry bicycle corps. Just a couple of weeks ago, Dr. Ulysses Doss passed away. He was the founder of the university's Black Studies program. In 1974, members of that program recreated and reenacted the ride to St. Louis. So this would honor his
Oh, excellent.
because he was part of making
Oh, that's excellent. Yeah. Thank you for that. Anybody else? Well, thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.